The house breathed with memories I had never lived. I stood in the doorway of my grandmother's Victorian home, keys heavy in my palm like secrets waiting to be unlocked. 3 months had passed since her funeral, 3 months of lawyers and paperwork and the strange inheritance of a life I barely knew. Now here I was, 28 years old and suddenly the owner of a house that felt more like a museum of whispered stories. The moving truck had left hours ago, my few belongings scattered among rooms that seemed to stretch beyond their physical boundaries. I was a writer who preferred emptiness, clean lines, silence. This house was the opposite of everything I had built my adult life around. Every surface was adorned with something. Lace doilies, porcelain figurines, and mirrors. So many mirrors. They hung in gilded frames along the hallway, perched on antique dressers, stood floor-length in corners like silent sentinels. As I walked through the house that first evening, I caught glimpses of myself multiplied endlessly. A woman with dark hair pulled back severely, wearing clothes that suggested someone who had forgotten how to be touched. The mirrors seemed to judge me, to find me wanting in ways I couldn't name. My grandmother had been a woman of secrets. Even my mother, Sarah, had spoken of her own mother in hushed tones, as if afraid that speaking too loudly about the past might summon it back. I had visited this house only twice as a child, brief uncomfortable visits where I felt like an intruder in someone else's dream. Now it was mine, and I was still an intruder. I chose the smallest bedroom upstairs, pushing aside heavy curtains to let in what remained of the daylight. The room came with its own mirror, an ornate vanity piece that seemed too grand for such an intimate space. I avoided looking at it directly as I unpacked my laptop, my few books, the sparse wardrobe of a woman who had learned to travel light through life. That night, I lay in the narrow bed and listened to the house settle around me. Every creak felt like a conversation I wasn't invited to join. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of women I had never met, dancing in rooms filled with mirrors that reflected not their bodies but their longings. I woke feeling watched. Writing had always been my escape from the messiness of human connection. Words on a page were safe, controllable, unable to leave without warning or demand more than I was willing to give. I set up my workspace in the front parlor, positioning my laptop so that my back was to the large mirror that dominated the far wall. But even with my back turned, I felt its presence. 3 days into my new life in this house of echoes, I was deep in a story about solitude, my favorite subject, when movement caught my peripheral vision. I turned, expecting to see a bird outside the window or perhaps a curtain stirring in the breeze. Instead, I saw her. In the mirror's reflection, a woman stood behind me. Not me, though she shared my height, my general build. Her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders instead of being pulled back in my habitual severe knot. She wore a sundress the color of summer rain, something I would never choose, never allow myself to be vulnerable enough to wear. I spun around. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, she was gone. My hands trembled as I closed my laptop. Stress, I told myself. The upheaval of moving, of inheriting this strange house with its weight of untold stories. I was imagining things, projecting some unconscious desire for companionship onto reflective surfaces. But that night, as I brushed my teeth in the upstairs bathroom, I saw her again. This time she wasn't behind me but facing me, moving in perfect synchronization with my movements until the moment I noticed her. Then she stopped, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth, her eyes meeting mine through the glass with an expression of startled recognition. I dropped my toothbrush. The porcelain clattered against the sink, loud in the sudden silence. When I looked up, the mirror showed only my own pale face, my own wide eyes filled with something that might have been longing or might have been fear. Her name came to me in dreams before I ever heard it spoken. Zoe. It tasted like summer rain and promises I had never learned to make. I would wake with the syllables on my tongue, wondering why a name I had never heard felt like coming home. The mirror encounters became more frequent. Never frightening, never threatening, but always achingly familiar. She would appear when I was distracted, lost in thought or in the rhythm of writing. Always just different enough from me to be clearly someone else. Always just similar enough to feel like she belonged in my reflection. Sometimes she would smile, and I would feel my own face respond before I remembered that we were separated by more than glass. Sometimes she would reach toward the mirror's surface, her palm pressed against what must have been her side of whatever impossible barrier existed between us. I began to position mirrors strategically around my workspace, telling myself it was coincidence, that I was merely rearranging furniture. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. I was hoping to see her again. It was during one of these vigils that I first heard my name whispered from somewhere beyond the silver surface. I was reading in the parlor, a book balanced on my knees, when the sound came, soft as breath against glass, clear as a prayer. Aurora. I looked up to find her standing in the mirror, but this time she wasn't mimicking my position. She was facing the glass directly, her lips moving in the shape of my name. Her hand was pressed against her side of the mirror, fingers splayed as if she could push through the surface through sheer will. Aurora, she whispered again, and this time I could see the pain in her eyes, the desperate longing that I recognized because it lived in my own chest, had always lived there without explanation. I stood slowly, the book sliding forgotten to the floor. Step by step, I approached the mirror until I stood directly across from her. We were the same height, our eyes level, separated by what felt like everything and nothing. Who are you? I whispered to the glass. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. She pressed both palms against the mirror now, leaning forward as if she could somehow push through to where I stood. The expression on her face was one of desperate communication, of someone with 1,000 things to say and no voice to say them. I raised my own hand slowly, until my palm rested against the glass. The surface was warm where our hands would have met, impossibly warm, as if she were generating heat from her side of whatever impossible space we shared. For a moment, just a moment, I could have sworn I felt her touch. The visions started 3 weeks after I first saw her. They came without warning, usually in the spaces between sleep and waking, in the soft moments when consciousness hadn't yet built its walls. I would be brushing my hair or making tea, and suddenly I would be somewhere else, someone else, living a life that felt more real than the one I had been born into. In these glimpses, I was still Aurora, but a different Aurora. Softer, more open, unafraid of letting someone see me without my carefully constructed armor. And Zoe was there. Not trapped behind glass but warm and solid and laughing as she pulled me into her arms. I saw us in a garden I had never visited, lying on a blanket under stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. Zoe's head was on my shoulder, her fingers tracing patterns on my palm while she told me stories about the constellations. Her voice was pitched low and intimate, the voice of someone who had earned the right to all my secrets. I saw us in a kitchen filled with morning light, dancing barefoot to music only we could hear. Zoe spun me around, her sundress the same color as the one I had seen her wearing in the mirror, and I was laughing. Actually laughing, in a way I hadn't since childhood. When she dipped me low, her kiss tasted like coffee and forever. I saw us curled together in bed on a rainy afternoon, reading to each other from books of poetry. Zoe's voice gave weight to words I had only ever experienced silently, made them live in the space between us. When she finished a particularly beautiful passage, she would look at me with eyes that held no doubts, no reservations, only a love so complete it made my chest ache with its impossibility. But the visions weren't all light and laughter. I saw arguments too, passionate disagreements that ended with desperate kisses and whispered apologies. I saw tears, mine and hers, over some tension I couldn't quite grasp but that felt familiar as my own heartbeat. And I saw the night everything changed. It was raining, the kind of summer storm that turns the air electric with possibility. Zoe and I were on the porch of a house that looked like my grandmother's but felt entirely different. Lived in, loved in, alive with the warmth of shared dreams. She was trying to convince me of something, her hands gesturing with the passion she brought to everything she cared about. We could do this, she was saying, though I couldn't quite catch what this was. We could be brave, Aurora. We could choose love over fear. But the Aurora in the vision was shaking her head, stepping backward toward a decision that would change everything. I could feel the fear that drove her, fear of vulnerability, of needing someone so much that their absence would break you, of loving so completely that losing it would mean losing yourself. I can't, that other Aurora whispered, and the words tasted like ash in my mouth even as I dreamed them. I'm not brave enough for this. I watched Zoe's face crumble, watched hope die in her eyes and replace itself with a pain so profound it seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The rain fell harder, as if the sky were mourning what was being lost. Then I guess this is goodbye, Zoe said, and her voice was steady but her hands were shaking. That other Aurora nodded, unable to speak past the grief that was choking her. She turned away, walked down the porch steps into the rain, and never looked back. But I felt her looking back. Even as she walked away, even as she made the choice that would split their world in two, I felt the part of her that wanted to run back, to throw herself into Zoe's arms and choose love over safety. She never did. I woke from these visions with tears on my cheeks and a hole in my chest where something precious had been torn away. The grief felt more real than anything in my actual life, more immediate than any loss I had ever experienced. And in the mirrors throughout the house, Zoe watched me with eyes that held the same devastation I carried. The bathroom mirror became our primary means of communication. It started small, a handprint that would appear in the steam after my shower, slightly different from my own, longer fingers, more delicate palm. I would trace it with my fingertip, trying to memorize the shape of her touch, and watch as it faded back into condensation. Then came the words. I miss us, appeared one morning, written backward so I could read it from my side of the glass. The letters were shaky, formed by what must have been a trembling finger, and they carried such weight of longing that I had to grip the sink to steady myself. I pressed my palm against the steamed surface and wrote back, I remember us. It was true, though I couldn't explain how memories of a life I had never lived could feel more real than the life I was currently breathing. But standing there in the aftermath of another vision, another glimpse of the love I had walked away from, I knew that the Aurora in that other world had made the wrong choice. I had made the wrong choice. More messages followed. Do you ever wonder what if? Appeared during a thunderstorm, the letters wavering as if written by someone crying. I wrote back, every day. I dream about your laugh, she wrote, and I realized I had been withholding laughter from this life, rationing joy as if it were something dangerous. I've forgotten how to laugh, I admitted to the steam. I remember. Let me teach you again. But how could she teach me anything when we were separated by whatever impossible barrier kept us apart? How could we find our way back to each other when I didn't even understand what had driven us apart? The answer came in pieces, fragments of understanding that assembled themselves slowly like a puzzle made of heartbreak. I began to research the house, diving into local history and genealogy websites. What I found made my hands shake as I typed. My grandmother had had a sister, a twin sister named Rose who had died young. The house had been in their family for generations, passed down through a line of women who seemed to have a talent for love stories that ended in tragedy. But it was in my grandmother's old letters, found in a trunk in the attic, that I discovered the key to everything. Rose had been my grandmother's twin, but more than that, she had been her best friend, her confidant, her chosen family. They had lived in this house together until Rose fell in love with a woman named Elena. The letters spoke of a love so complete it seemed to bend reality around it, of two souls so perfectly matched that their friends joked they shared the same heartbeat. But it was 1952, and such love was not only forbidden but dangerous. When the town began to whisper, when Rose's job was threatened and Elena faced the possibility of being sent away by her family, my grandmother had intervened. I convinced Rose to leave. My grandmother had written to a friend. I thought I was protecting her, saving her from the pain that was coming. But I see now that I was only afraid of what loving someone that completely might cost, afraid of watching her choose someone else over the safety we had built together. Rose had left Elena, left the town, left the house. She had died 3 years later in a car accident, alone and heartbroken. My grandmother had lived with the guilt for the rest of her life, wondering if love might have been worth any price. The letter ended with words that made me understand everything. I dream sometimes that there's another world where I encouraged her to be brave, where I helped her fight for love instead of running from it. In that world, they're together, and Rose is still alive, still laughing the way she used to when Elena would surprise her with wildflowers. I closed the letter with shaking hands, finally understanding. Zoe wasn't just a reflection of me. She was me, from the world where we had chosen differently. The world where Aurora had been brave enough to stay, to fight, to choose love over safety. The mirrors weren't showing me a ghost. They were showing me the life I could have had, the love I had walked away from, the woman I could have been if I hadn't been so afraid. That night, I stood before the parlor mirror for hours, waiting. The house was silent around me, heavy with the weight of stories that demanded to be finished. I had lit candles, their flames flickering in the glass surface like distant stars, creating an atmosphere that felt suspended between worlds. When Zoe finally appeared, she looked as exhausted as I felt. Her eyes were red from crying, her sundress wrinkled as if she had been sleeping in it. She pressed both palms against her side of the mirror and looked at me with such desperate longing that I felt my resolve crack and reform into something stronger. I know what happened, I whispered to the glass. I know what I did to us. Her lips moved. Aurora. I'm sorry, I continued, my voice growing stronger. I'm sorry I was too afraid to fight for us. I'm sorry I chose safety over love. I'm sorry I walked away when you needed me to stay. Tears were streaming down her face now, and I could see my own reflection crying in response. But these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of forgiveness, of love that had been waiting patiently for acknowledgement. I placed my hands against the mirror, matching the position of hers. The glass was warm again, impossibly warm, and for a moment I could have sworn I felt her pulse beating against my palms. I love you, I whispered. I have always loved you, even in this world where we never met. Every choice I've made has been shaped by the absence of you. Every wall I've built has been to protect the space where you should have been. Zoe's mouth opened in what might have been a sob or a laugh. She leaned forward until her forehead touched the glass, and I mirrored her movement. We were as close as we could be while remaining in our separate worlds, breathing on opposite sides of the same impossible barrier. And then something shifted. The mirror's surface rippled like water, the silver backing seeming to dissolve into liquid light. I felt heat radiating through the glass, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with connection, with love that had been denied too long. Aurora, Zoe whispered, and this time I heard her voice clearly, as if she was standing in the same room instead of trapped in another world. I pressed harder against the mirror, and the surface gave slightly under my touch. Not like glass, like membrane, like the thin boundary between heartbeats, between one breath and the next. Can you hear me? I asked. I can hear you. Her voice was thick with tears and wonder. I've been trying to reach you for so long. How long have you been there? Since the night you walked away. Since the moment our worlds split apart. She pressed her face closer to the glass, and I could see every detail now, the freckles across her nose, the scar on her chin from childhood, the eyes that held no secrets from me. In my world, I've been waiting by every mirror, hoping you would find your way back to me. I want to come back, I whispered. I want to choose you this time. The barrier is weakening, she said, wonder in her voice. I can feel it. When you admitted you loved me, when you chose to see the truth instead of hiding from it, something changed. I could feel it too. The mirror was becoming less solid, more permeable, as if love itself were dissolving the boundaries between worlds. Where our hands pressed against the surface, I could see the glass beginning to bow outward, reality bending under the pressure of our need for each other. What happens if I cross over? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe you become part of my world. Maybe I become part of yours. Maybe we create something new together. Are you afraid? She smiled then, the first smile I had seen from her that wasn't shadowed by grief. Terrified. But not of being with you. Only of losing you again. I understood. The fear wasn't of love, it was of the possibility that love might not be enough, that the same barriers that had driven us apart before might rise again. But looking at her face, seeing the way she looked at me with no reservations, no conditions, only acceptance and hope and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches, I knew that some things were worth any risk. I'm going to try, I said. Are you sure? I've spent my whole life being sure of the wrong things, I told her. Let me be uncertain about something beautiful for once. She laughed, and the sound was like music I had been waiting my entire life to hear. I love you, Aurora. In every world, in every possibility, I love you. I love you too, I whispered, and meant it with every cell of my being. I pressed both palms flat against the mirror and pushed. The glass gave way like warm honey. My hands passed through the mirror's surface into air that tasted of summer rain and possibilities I had never dared to dream. The sensation was indescribable, like stepping through the skin of the world into someplace more real, more true than anything I had ever experienced. Zoe's fingers found mine in the space between worlds, and her touch sent electricity through every nerve ending I possessed. She was solid, warm, more real than my own reflection had ever been. Her hands were exactly as I had dreamed them, long-fingered, gentle, marked with small scars that told stories of a life fully lived. Aurora, she breathed, and hearing my name in her voice without the barrier of glass between us was like being born for the first time. I pushed further through the mirror, feeling the strange sensation of existing in two realities at once. Behind me was my grandmother's house, solid and familiar and empty of everything I had ever truly wanted. Ahead of me was Zoe's world, the same house but alive with warmth, filled with the evidence of lives shared and love chosen despite its difficulties. The mirror's frame held me suspended between both realities, and I could feel the pull of each world like competing gravities. If I went back, I would return to safety, to solitude, to the carefully constructed life that had protected me from ever being hurt badly enough to matter. If I went forward, I would be choosing uncertainty, vulnerability, the terrifying possibility of loving someone so completely that losing them would remake me entirely. I can't pull you through, Zoe said, her voice urgent with need and something else. Respect for my choice, even if it meant losing me again. You have to choose to come. I looked past her into the room that was almost identical to the one I was leaving, but transformed by the evidence of her presence. Books lay open on tables, their margins filled with notes in handwriting I somehow recognized. A mug sat beside a window seat, still steaming with tea that suggested a life paused mid-sip to answer the call of love. Photographs lined the mantelpiece. Pictures of Zoe with friends I had never met but who looked familiar anyway, their smiles suggesting the kind of community I had never allowed myself to find. And there, in the center of it all, was evidence of me. A writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, papers scattered across its surface covered in words I had never written but that sounded like my voice. A sweater draped over a chair, cream-colored wool that I would never have chosen but that looked comfortable in a way I had never allowed myself to be. This was the life I could have had. The love I could have known. The version of myself I could have become if I had been brave enough to stay, to fight, to choose connection over protection. What happens to my world if I leave it? I asked. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe it continues without you. Maybe it fades. Maybe someone else makes the choice you couldn't make the first time. Behind me, in my grandmother's empty house, I could feel the weight of all the women who had chosen safety over love, who had died with their hearts unbroken but also untouched. My grandmother's letters, full of regret for the sister she had failed to encourage toward bravery. Rose's life, cut short by the pain of love denied. Generations of women who had chosen survival over the risk of truly living. Ahead of me was Zoe, her hand extended, offering everything I had ever wanted and been too afraid to reach for. The choice was mine, and this time, I knew what I had to do. I stepped through the mirror completely, leaving behind the world where love was a luxury I couldn't afford. The moment my feet touched the floor of Zoe's reality, the mirror behind me solidified again, becoming once more simple glass that reflected only what stood before it. I was committed now, fully present in a world where I had chosen love over fear. Zoe's arms came around me immediately, and the sensation of being held by her was like coming home to a country I had never visited but had always belonged to. She was exactly the right height for her chin to rest on my shoulder, exactly the right warmth to make me understand why people talked about other halves and missing pieces. You came back, she whispered against my hair. I came forward, I corrected, and felt her smile against my neck. We held each other in the candlelit room, and I marveled at how perfectly I fit against her, how my body seemed to remember hers even though we had never touched in this reality. Her hands traced patterns on my back, gentle explorations that felt like questions. Are you real? Are you staying? Are you mine? The answers were yes, yes, and yes. When we finally separated enough to look at each other, I saw that her eyes were bright with tears of joy. She lifted her hands to frame my face, thumbs brushing across my cheekbones as if she were memorizing my features. I can't believe you're here, she said. I can't believe you chose this. I chose you, I said, and the words felt like the truest thing I had ever spoken. I chose us. She kissed me then, and it was like every kiss I had ever dreamed of but had been too afraid to reach for. Soft and urgent and full of 3 years' worth of longing, 3 years of standing on opposite sides of mirrors wishing for a touch that seemed impossible. Her lips tasted like summer storms and second chances. When she deepened the kiss, I understood why poets wrote about dying from love, not because it killed you, but because it made you so alive that your old self had to die to make room for who you were becoming. Are you hungry? She asked when we broke apart, the question so beautifully domestic that I laughed. Starving, I realized, though I wasn't sure if I meant for food or for the simple pleasure of being cared for. She led me to the kitchen, her hand warm in mine, and I marveled at how different the same space could feel when it was inhabited by love instead of solitude. The kitchen was full of evidence of shared meals. 2 mugs by the sink, a cutting board with the remnants of vegetables prepared by someone who cooked for the joy of feeding someone they cared about. I kept hoping, Zoe said as she moved around the kitchen with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own space. Every day, I would set out 2 cups for tea, just in case. Every night, I would make enough dinner for 2, just in case. The simple faith of it, The way she had maintained space for me even when I wasn't there to fill it, made my chest tight with emotion I didn't have words for. I wasted so much time being afraid, I said. She paused in her movements, turning to look at me with eyes that held no judgment, only understanding. Fear isn't wasted time if it teaches you what courage looks like. I watched her prepare tea for both of us, noticed how she knew without asking that I preferred honey to sugar, that I liked my cup warm enough to wrap my hands around. These were intimacies she had learned during the years we had been together in her reality, knowledge earned through the daily practice of loving someone. Tell me about your world, I said as we sat at the small table that had clearly been chosen for conversations just like this one. Our world, she corrected gently. Tell me about our world. So she did. She told me about the garden we had planted together, where vegetables grew alongside wildflowers because I had never been able to choose between beauty and practicality. She told me about the writing I had been doing. Not the careful, distant stories I had written in my old reality, but pieces full of warmth and connection, stories about people who chose love despite its risks. She told me about our friends, a chosen family of people who had supported us through the difficult early years when the world was less accepting, who had celebrated with us when we had finally felt safe enough to be open about our love. She told me about Maria, who ran the bookstore where I did readings, about Kenneth, who had helped us install the garden beds, about Jones, who was a doctor and who had been there during the pneumonia that had nearly taken me 2 winters ago. You were so stubborn about going to the hospital, she said, smiling at the memory. You kept insisting you were fine, right up until you collapsed in the middle of reading me a story you had written about a woman who was too proud to admit she needed help. I could picture it perfectly, the way I would have downplayed my symptoms, afraid to be vulnerable even in the face of serious illness. What changed my mind? You didn't change your mind, she said, her smile growing wider. I carried you to the car and refused to listen to any of your protests. You were furious with me for about 3 days, until Jones told you that I had saved your life by not taking no for an answer. The idea of Zoe caring for me, fighting for my health even when I was too stubborn to accept help, filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea I was drinking. In my old reality, there had been no one to notice if I was sick, no one to insist I take care of myself when my instinct was to suffer alone. What else? I asked, hungry for these stories of the life we had built together. She told me about our morning routines, how I was grumpy before tea but became chatty once I was properly caffeinated, how she liked to wake up slowly while I preferred to start the day with purpose. She told me about our arguments, which were rare but passionate, usually ending with us remembering that being right was less important than being in love. She told me about the way I would read my stories aloud to her, using different voices for different characters, and how I would blush when she applauded. She told me about the way she would garden while I wrote, both of us working in comfortable parallel silence until one of us would look up and catch the other watching with unguarded affection. These were the small intimacies that made up a life shared, the daily negotiations and discoveries that happened when 2 people chose to build something together. I had never experienced anything like it, had never even imagined that love could be so practical, so comfortable, so woven into the fabric of ordinary days. I want all of that, I told her when she finished. I want the arguments and the morning routines and the way you take care of me even when I'm too stubborn to ask for help. You have it, she said simply. You've always had it. You just needed to be brave enough to step into it. The days that followed were a revelation in what it meant to be loved and to love in return. I woke each morning to the sound of Zoe humming in the kitchen, to the smell of tea steeping and toast browning, to the knowledge that someone was happy I had survived another night. She would bring me a cup while I was still in bed, settling beside me to talk about dreams or plans for the day or nothing at all. You're a completely different person in the morning than you were when you first came here, she observed one morning about a week after my crossing. Softer. Less like you're braced for attack. I considered this, sipping my perfectly prepared tea and feeling the truth of it in my bones. I spent so many years building walls, I said. I forgot that they were meant to keep things out, not to keep me in. And now I'm learning what it feels like to live without them. It was harder than I had expected, this business of being vulnerable. My old reflexes were strong, the urge to withdraw when emotions became too intense, the instinct to deflect intimacy with humor or work or any distraction that would keep me from having to face the terrifying depth of what I felt for her. But Zoe was patient with my learning curve, gentle with my failures, encouraging when I managed to stay present through moments that would have sent the old Aurora running. When I tensed up during a particularly tender moment, she would simply hold me until the fear passed. When I started to build walls out of habit, she would wait quietly until I remembered that I didn't need them anymore. Love isn't something you have to earn, she told me one evening as we lay in bed, my head on her chest, listening to the steady rhythm of her heart. It's not something you can lose by being imperfect. How do you know? I asked. Because I've been loving you imperfectly for 3 years, and it hasn't gotten any smaller. If anything, it grows every time you let me see more of who you really are. I was learning to write differently too. The stories that had once been exercises in emotional distance became explorations of connection. Characters who had once stood apart from the world now reached for each other, chose vulnerability over safety, found strength in the admission of need. Maria, who ran the bookstore, noticed the change immediately when I came in to browse for new books. Your last reading was different, she said, studying my face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read people like text. More alive. Like you finally figured out what you wanted to say. I think I finally figured out who I wanted to say it to, I replied, and she smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly that realization. Kenneth, who stopped by to help with some repair work on the house, was more direct in his observations. You laugh now, he said, straightening from where he had been fixing a loose board on the porch steps. Used to be you smiled politely when something was funny. Now you actually laugh. It was true. Zoe had taught me to find joy in small things. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table, the sound of rain on the roof, the simple pleasure of her hand in mine as we walked through the garden we were tending together. Laughter came easier when you weren't constantly braced for disappointment. But it was Richard, Zoe's elderly neighbor, who made the observation that affected me most deeply. You two look like you belong together, he said one afternoon as we worked in the front yard, pruning roses that had grown wild with neglect. Like you're parts of the same story. I looked at Zoe, dirt smudged on her cheek and contentment in her eyes, and understood what he meant. We moved around each other with the easy coordination of people who had learned each other's rhythms, who had negotiated the space between independence and interdependence until we found the balance that worked for both of us. We are parts of the same story, I said, and meant it more than I had ever meant anything. That night, as we lay in bed reading, me with a book of poetry, Zoe with a novel about women who chose love despite impossible odds, I felt the profound rightness of the choice I had made. Not just the choice to cross through the mirror, but every small choice that followed, to stay present when fear urged me to flee, to speak honestly when silence felt safer, to trust that love could be a foundation rather than a luxury I couldn't afford. Read to me, Zoe said, closing her book and turning toward me with the expectant smile that never failed to make my heart skip. I found a poem about second chances and read it aloud, my voice growing steadier with each line. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing absent patterns on my arm. Do you ever miss your old life? She asked softly. I considered the question seriously. Did I miss the safety of emotional distance? The predictability of solitude? The way I had never had to worry about someone else's feelings or needs. I miss the simplicity of it sometimes, I admitted. It was easier to be alone. But easy isn't the same as right. And this feels right? I turned to face her fully, taking in the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in her eyes, the way her hair fell across the pillow we now shared, the way she looked at me with patience and curiosity, and the kind of love that asked questions because it wanted to know me better, not because it doubted my answers. This feels like the life I was supposed to be living all along, I said. Like I spent 30 years walking in the wrong direction, and you helped me find my way home. She kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promises we were finally brave enough to make to each other. Spring arrived with a fury of possibility. Zoe woke me one morning with excitement bright in her voice and dirt already under her fingernails. "Come see," she said, pulling me from bed with gentle insistence. "Come see what survived the winter." The garden behind our house. I had learned to think of it as ours, learned to claim space in a way I never had before, was erupting with new growth. Bulbs we had planted together the previous fall were pushing through the earth with determined green shoots. Perennials that had seemed dead were showing signs of life along their woody stems. "I wasn't sure the lavender would make it," Zoe said, kneeling beside a patch of what looked like dried sticks. The winter was harder than usual. But there, at the base of the seemingly lifeless plants, tiny silver-green leaves were emerging. Life persisting despite the appearance of death, beauty returning after a season of dormancy. We spent the morning working in the garden together, preparing beds for new plantings, clearing away the debris of winter to make room for growth. I had never been much of a gardener in my old life, had never seen the point in nurturing something that might not survive, but working beside Zoe, I began to understand the faith involved in planting seeds. "Gardening is a lot like love," she said as we worked, her hands gentle as she transplanted seedlings she had started indoors. "You prepare the soil, plant with hope, tend carefully, and trust that growth will come in its own time." I thought about this as I helped her create space for new roses along the fence line. The parallels were obvious once she pointed them out. The way both required patience, attention, the willingness to nurture something through seasons of apparent dormancy before seeing results. I was never good at waiting, I admitted, struggling with a particularly stubborn root system. "You're learning," she said, and the pride in her voice made me feel capable of anything. That afternoon, we drove to the nursery to select new plants for the spaces we had prepared. Zoe moved through the rows of possibilities with the enthusiasm of someone who saw potential everywhere, while I followed more cautiously, still learning to believe in my ability to keep living things alive. "What about these?" she asked, stopping before a display of climbing roses in shades of pink and white and deep red. "They're beautiful," I said, "but what if I kill them?" She turned to look at me with the gentle patience she brought to all my anxieties. "What if you don't? What if you discover you have a gift for helping things grow?" It was a radical thought, that I might be someone who nurtured rather than someone who withdrew, someone who created beauty rather than someone who preserved safety through emptiness. But standing there surrounded by the promise of blooming things, with Zoe's faith in me like sunlight on my shoulders, I began to believe it might be possible. We loaded the car with roses and herbs and flowers that would bloom at different times throughout the season, ensuring that there would always be something beautiful to discover in our shared space. The nursery owner, a woman named Helen who had known Zoe for years, helped us tie everything down securely. "Your garden is going to be stunning this year," she told us as we prepared to leave. I can always tell when gardeners are planting with love instead of just planting with hope. On the drive home, with the sweet scent of roses filling the car and Zoe's hand warm in mine, I felt something I had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction of building something lasting with someone I loved. Not just the garden, but the relationship itself. tending it daily with small acts of care, watching it grow stronger and more beautiful with time and attention. "I love you," I said suddenly, the words spilling out with the force of realization. "I love you too," she replied, squeezing my hand. "Even more than I did yesterday, which I wouldn't have thought was possible." That evening, as we planted our new acquisitions in the spaces we had prepared, I understood that this was what happiness looked like: dirt under my fingernails, aching muscles from honest work, and the woman I loved beside me, both of us investing in a future we would tend together. "What do you think it will look like in full bloom?" I asked, sitting back on my heels to survey our work. "Like home," Zoe said simply. "It will look like home." Summer arrived like a promise kept. The garden we had planted together exploded into color and fragrance that transformed our small yard into something magical. The climbing roses scaled the fence in cascades of pink and white, their perfume drifting through the open windows on warm evenings. The herbs we had tucked between the flowers, lavender and rosemary and thyme, released their scents whenever brushed by a passing breeze or by us as we moved through the space we had created together. I had learned to trust in growth, to believe that things I tended would flourish rather than die under my care. More than that, I had learned to find joy in the daily rituals of care. Watering in the early morning when the air was still cool, deadheading spent blooms to encourage new ones, watching for the first signs of buds that would become flowers. "You've become quite the gardener," Zoe observed one morning as I carefully staked a tomato plant that was growing faster than its support could handle. "I've become quite a lot of things I never expected," I replied, and felt the truth of it in my bones. I had become someone who laughed easily, who reached for comfort instead of enduring discomfort alone, who spoke her needs instead of suffering in silence. I had become someone who could receive love without constantly questioning whether I deserved it, who could give love without fearing it would be rejected or taken for granted. The writing was flowing differently too. Instead of stories about isolation and emotional distance, I found myself creating characters who chose connection, who fought for love, who discovered that vulnerability was not weakness but the foundation of genuine strength. Maria had started asking for more pieces for the bookstore's reading series, and I had discovered the unexpected joy of sharing work that came from an open heart instead of a defended one. "Your latest story made Mrs. Patterson cry," Maria told me after one particularly well-attended reading. Happy tears, mind you. She said it reminded her of her own love story, back when she was young and had to be brave about loving someone the world said she shouldn't. These connections, with readers, with community, with the recognition that love stories matter because they give people permission to believe in love, felt like the purpose I had been searching for without knowing it. Not just to tell stories, but to tell stories that helped people recognize the courage in their own choices. But it was the quiet moments with Zoe that taught me the most about what I had gained by choosing love over safety. The way she would bring me tea while I wrote, setting it down quietly so as not to disturb my concentration. The way she would read over my shoulder sometimes, not to judge but to share in the joy of creation. The way she would celebrate my small victories, a particularly good sentence, a character who surprised me with their depth, a story that said exactly what I had hoped it would say. "I'm proud of you," she said one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the garden we had made together. "Not just for the writing, but for becoming who you were meant to be." "I couldn't have done it without you," I said, and meant it completely. "You could have," she replied. "It would have taken longer, maybe, and been lonelier, but you had all this inside you already. I just helped you remember it was safe to let it out." As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of another cycle of dormancy and renewal, I found myself looking forward instead of backward for the first time in my adult life. There would be more gardens to plant, more stories to write, more seasons to share with the woman who had taught me that love was not a luxury but a necessity, not a weakness but the source of all true strength. "What are you thinking about?" Zoe asked, noticing my contemplative mood. Time, I said. How I spent so many years afraid of it passing, afraid of wasting it, afraid of not having enough. And now I want more of it. I want years and years of this, of us, of growing things together, of becoming more ourselves by being together. She was quiet for a moment, and when I looked at her, I saw tears in her eyes. That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said to me, she whispered. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever felt, I replied. That night, as we lay in bed listening to the night sounds of our neighborhood, cats calling to each other, the distant sound of laughter from a late dinner party, the gentle whisper of wind through the leaves of trees we had watched change through the seasons, I felt the profound peace of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Not just a physical place, though the house had become truly home in a way I had never experienced. Not just an emotional place, though I had learned to inhabit my own heart without fear. But a relational place, the space that existed between Zoe and me, the life we had built together through daily choices to love each other, to stay present with each other, to trust that what we were creating was worth the risk it had taken to choose it. The mirrors throughout the house had become ordinary again, reflecting only what stood before them instead of showing me glimpses of other worlds, other possibilities. But sometimes when the light fell just right, I would catch a glimpse of that other Aurora, the one who had walked away, who had chosen safety over love, who had lived her whole life wondering what if. She looked older now, more tired, marked by the weight of a choice that had shaped every day since. But there was something else in her face too, a kind of peace, as if she had finally made her own peace with the path she had chosen. One evening, as I was brushing my teeth before bed, I saw her clearly in the bathroom mirror. Instead of looking away or pretending I hadn't seen her, I met her eyes through the glass. Thank you, I whispered to my reflection, to her, to the version of myself who had lived the consequences of fear so that I could learn what courage looked like. She smiled, a sad smile, but also proud, as if she were glad that at least one version of our story had found its way to happiness. She lifted her hand in what might have been a wave or a blessing, and then she was gone, leaving only my own reflection and the knowledge that some gifts come from the strangest places. What was that about? Zoe asked when I joined her in bed, her voice soft with curiosity rather than concern. Saying goodbye, I said. To the woman I used to be, to the life I used to think I wanted. To the fear that kept me safe but also kept me small. She pulled me close, and I settled against her warmth with the grateful sigh of someone who had finally learned to accept comfort instead of enduring discomfort alone. Any regrets? She asked. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the years of loneliness that had led me to this point? The fear that had kept me from love for so long? The pain I had caused myself and others by choosing distance over connection? I regret how long it took me to find the courage, I said finally. But I don't regret the path that led me here. Every choice, even the wrong ones, taught me something about what I really wanted. And they all led me to you. They led us to each other, she corrected, and I felt the truth of it settle into my bones. Outside our window, the garden we had planted together rustled in the night breeze. Tomorrow there would be new buds to discover, new growth to tend, new small miracles of life persisting and flourishing under our care. There would be stories to write and tea to share, and the thousand small intimacies that made up a life built with someone you loved. There would be challenges too, there always were. Days when fear would whisper that this was too good to last, moments when old patterns would try to reassert themselves, seasons when growth would be slow and patience would be required. But I had learned something that the other Aurora had never discovered, that love was not something you had to earn or something you could lose through imperfection. It was something you practiced, something you chose again and again, something that grew stronger through the daily decision to stay present with another person's heart. I love you, I whispered into the darkness, the words carrying the weight of gratitude for the woman who had waited for me to be brave enough to find her, for the love that had been patient enough to survive my fear, for the life we were building together one choice at a time. I love you too, she whispered back. In this world and every other world, in every mirror and every reflection, in every story that has ever been told about love finding a way. And in the quiet of our shared bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of the life we had chosen together, I finally understood what home meant. Not a place but a person, not safety but love, not the absence of risk but the presence of someone worth risking everything for. The girl in the mirror had shown me what was possible. The woman in my arms had shown me it was real. I wake to the sound of Zoe humming in the kitchen, to the smell of tea steeping and bread toasting, to the knowledge that someone is happy I survived another night. It has been 1 year since I stepped through the mirror, 1 year since I chose love over fear, and I am still learning daily what it means to be someone who stays instead of someone who leaves. The garden is preparing for another winter, but this year I am not afraid of the dormancy. I have learned that things can appear to die and still return in spring, that love planted deeply enough can survive any season of difficulty. My latest story is about a woman who finds herself by learning to lose herself in someone else's happiness, and Maria has asked me to read it at next week's event. The bookstore has become a second home, a place where my words find their way to people who need to hear that love is possible, that courage can be learned, that it is never too late to choose a different story. But it is here, in this kitchen where Zoe prepares our morning tea with the practiced care of someone who has learned exactly how I like it, that I have found what I spent my whole life looking for without knowing I was searching. Not just love, but the daily practice of love. Not just acceptance, but the choice to stay present even when presence requires courage. Good morning, beautiful, she says, turning to smile at me with eyes that hold no secrets, no reservations, only the steady warmth of someone who has seen all of me and chosen to stay. Good morning, I reply, and mean it with every cell of my being. Outside the window, the mirror of the garden pond reflects the early morning sky, and for just a moment, I think I see another Aurora looking back. The one who chose differently, who lived her whole life wondering what if. But she is smiling, and I think she is glad that at least one version of our story found its way to happiness. The girl in the mirror taught me that love was possible. The woman making my tea taught me that love was worth choosing again and again, every day, in 1,000 small ways that add up to a life well lived. If Aurora and Zoe's story is touching your heart, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. Your support helps me create more lesbian romance audiobooks and helps other listeners discover these love stories when they need them most. Leave a comment about what's moving you. It means everything to creators like me, and I read every single one. Until our next story, may you have the courage to choose love over fear.